The setting sun painted the dust-laden streets of Redemption Creek with hues of amber and gold, casting long shadows across the weathered wooden buildings that lined the main thoroughfare. Sheriff Ethan Blackwood stood on the porch of the jailhouse, his calloused fingers absently tracing the silver star pinned to his chest. At 45, the lines etched into his face told stories of hardship and resolve, each wrinkle a testament to the harsh realities of maintaining law in a territory where justice often came from the barrel of a gun. His steel-gray eyes scanned the quiet street, watching as shopkeepers closed their doors and saloon patrons stumbled into the fading light. It had been 6 months since he'd brought order to this once lawless mining town. 6 months of relative peace that had allowed him to consider something he'd long thought impossible in his line of work: marriage. Tomorrow he would wed Eleanor Montgomery, the schoolteacher whose quiet strength had somehow penetrated the walls he'd built around his heart after 15 years of solitary duty. I hope you're enjoying this story so far. If you are, please consider subscribing to the channel. I'm curious, what city are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. The thought of Eleanor brought a rare smile to Ethan's weathered face. She had arrived in Redemption Creek a year ago, a widow from Boston, seeking a new start in the expanding West. Despite her refined Eastern manners, she had quickly adapted to frontier life, earning the respect of the townsfolk with her determination and compassion. What had begun as formal encounters, the sheriff escorting the new school teacher safely home after evening classes, had gradually evolved into something deeper, a connection that surprised them both. Ethan's reverie was interrupted by the distant sound of approaching hoofbeats, growing louder as they echoed between the buildings. His hand instinctively moved to rest on the worn walnut grip of his Colt Peacemaker. Years of experience had taught him that unexpected visitors at dusk rarely brought good news, especially in a town that had once been the territory of the notorious Carson Gang. The rider emerged from the gathering shadows at the edge of town, pushing his exhausted chestnut mare at a pace that spoke of urgency. Ethan recognized Thomas Wheeler, one of the young ranch hands from the Rockingham spread about 10 miles outside of town. The boy practically fell from his saddle, stumbling toward the sheriff with wide, frightened eyes. "Sheriff Blackwood, thank the Lord you're here," he gasped, clutching at Ethan's arm with trembling fingers. "It's Miss Montgomery's ranch. Raiders hit it about an hour ago. They took everything, burned the house." The boy's voice cracked as he delivered the final blow. "Miss Eleanor's brother, Samuel. They shot him dead when he tried to stop them." The world seemed to tilt beneath Ethan's feet, the peaceful evening shattered by news that threatened to unravel everything. Eleanor had inherited the small ranch from her late husband, and her younger brother had come west 6 months ago to help her run it before she sold it after the wedding. "Who did this, Thomas? Did you recognize any of them?" Ethan's voice remained steady, even as his mind raced through the implications. The boy shook his head, still trying to catch his breath. Wore bandanas over their faces, but one of them, the leader, had a silver-plated revolver with mother-of-pearl grips. Never seen anything like it. The description landed like a physical blow. Jack Carson, the last remaining leader of the gang Ethan had helped dismantle months ago. The man had escaped during the raid that had put 3 of his brothers in the ground and 2 more behind bars. Ethan had tracked him for weeks before the trail went cold in the mountains. Many believed Carson had fled to Mexico or perhaps even California. Now it seemed he had returned, and his target wasn't random. This was personal, a message meant specifically for the sheriff who had destroyed his family and criminal empire. "Where is Eleanor now?" Ethan demanded, already moving toward the livery stable where his stallion was kept. Thomas struggled to keep pace. Doc Sullivan's place. She wasn't hurt, wasn't at the ranch when it happened. She was in town getting fitted for her wedding dress when they hit. A small mercy in a storm of tragedy. But Ethan knew what would come next. Eleanor was no wilting flower. She had survived the loss of one husband already, had journeyed alone across a dangerous country to forge a new life. She would want blood for her brother's murder, blood that Ethan was bound by oath and badge to secure through legal means. Justice versus revenge, the conflict that defined so much of frontier life, was about to become intensely personal. Ethan saddled his horse with practiced efficiency, his mind already plotting the steps ahead. "Thomas, find Deputy Wilson and tell him what's happened. Have him organize a posse, good men, well-armed. No half-drunk cowboys looking for excitement." The sheriff checked his Winchester repeating rifle before sliding it into the leather scabbard attached to his saddle. "Then go to Judge Parker's house and wake him if necessary. I need warrants drawn up for Jack Carson and any known associates." The young man nodded, already backing toward the door. "What about Miss Montgomery? Should I tell her you're coming?" Ethan secured his saddlebags, which contained ammunition and basic supplies he always kept ready. "No, I'll see to Eleanor myself." As Thomas disappeared into the gathering darkness, Ethan mounted his black stallion and turned toward the doctor's residence on the east end of town, steeling himself for what promised to be the most difficult conversation of his life. Dr. Sullivan's home was a modest two-story structure with a small sign advertising his medical practice. A warm light glowed from the front windows, casting a deceptively peaceful aura over the scene that awaited inside. Ethan tied his horse to the hitching post and removed his hat as he approached the door, each step weighted with dread. The doctor himself answered Ethan's knock, his expression grim beneath his spectacles. "She's in the sitting room," Sullivan said quietly. "She refuses laudanum or anything to calm her nerves, says she needs to keep her wits about her." The older man placed a restraining hand on Ethan's arm. "She's not crying, Sheriff. Not a single tear. I've seen grief take many forms in my 30 years of practice, but her stillness, it concerns me." The sitting room was warm, lit by oil lamps that cast flickering shadows across the floral-patterned wallpaper. Eleanor sat rigidly in a high-backed chair, her normally vibrant features set in a mask of cold composure. At 35, she possessed a beauty that went beyond superficial features, an inner strength that shone through her blue eyes and determined chin. Now, those eyes met Ethan's with an intensity that stopped him in his tracks. "They murdered Samuel," she said, her voice unnaturally calm. "Shot him in the back while he was trying to save the horses from the burning stable." There was no question in her statement, just cold certainty. "Thomas told me what happened. Eleanor, I'm so sorry." The words felt hollow, inadequate against the magnitude of her loss, but Ethan pressed on. "I believe it was Jack Carson. He's come back, and this was his way of announcing his return." Carson. Eleanor tested the name, her fingers smoothing invisible wrinkles from her skirt. "The last of the gang you've been hunting?" A simple nod was all Ethan could manage as he moved to kneel before her chair, taking her cold hands in his. "I'm forming a posse tonight. We'll track them down, bring them to justice before a judge. Carson will hang for what he's done, I promise you that." Something flashed in Eleanor's eyes then, a momentary breach in her composed facade. Justice? The word hung between them, laden with meaning beyond its 5 simple letters. Samuel was 23 years old, Ethan. He came west because I asked him to. Because I wanted family near me as I started my new life with you. Her fingers tightened around his with surprising strength. What justice can a courtroom provide that would balance his life? What judge's sentence could possibly be enough? Ethan recognized the dangerous current flowing beneath her words. He had seen it before, in the eyes of men who strapped on guns to avenge fallen brothers, fathers seeking retribution for murdered sons. Eleanor, listen to me. I understand what you're feeling right now. She pulled her hands from his grasp, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. Do you? Have you buried a husband and now a brother? Have you watched everything you love be stripped away? The accusations stung, but Ethan kept his voice steady. No, but I've seen what happens when grief turns to bloodlust. I've buried men who chose revenge over justice, watched them become the very thing they hated. He reached for her again, but she stood abruptly, moving to the window, where she stared out at the darkened street. You're the law in this territory, Ethan. You have your duty, your oath. Eleanor's reflection in the glass showed a face transformed by grief and resolve. But I made no such promises. I have different obligations, to my family, to my brother's memory. A chill ran through Ethan that had nothing to do with the evening air. In that moment, he recognized what Dr. Sullivan had seen. Not the absence of emotion, but its transmutation into something far more dangerous. Eleanor turned to face him, her expression eerily calm once more. We should postpone the wedding. There are arrangements to be made for Samuel, and you have men to hunt. The words were practical, reasonable even, but Ethan heard the unspoken truth beneath them. The woman he loved was changing before his eyes, forging herself into something new in the crucible of grief. Dawn broke over Redemption Creek, painting the eastern sky with streaks of crimson that seemed ominously appropriate to Sheriff Blackwood. He stood on the steps of the jailhouse, watching as 6 men checked their mounts and provisions. They were good men, experienced frontiersmen, who understood the dangers they faced in pursuing the Carson gang. Deputy Wilson, a former Texas Ranger with a face weathered like old saddle leather, approached with a folded paper. Judge Parker signed the warrants. Carson and any men riding with him, dead or alive. The emphasis on the latter option was clear in Wilson's tone. Like many who had lived through the lawless years before Ethan's arrival, the deputy harbored little faith in the justice system's ability to deal with men like Jack Carson. Ethan tucked the document into his vest pocket, his expression betraying none of the conflict that had kept him awake through the night. "Any word on which direction they headed after the raid?" he asked, adjusting the cinch on his saddle one final time. Wilson nodded toward the mountains that loomed to the north. Storekeeper's boy was fishing up by Eagle Creek yesterday evening. Says he saw 5 riders heading into Blackwater Canyon around sundown. Didn't think much of it until he heard about what happened. Ethan's jaw tightened at the mention of Blackwater Canyon. The narrow passage through the mountains was infamous for its treacherous terrain and numerous caves that had sheltered outlaws for generations. If Carson had indeed returned to his old hideout, the posse would be riding into a potential ambush. "We'll approach from the eastern ridge," Ethan decided, mounting his horse with a fluid motion that belied his years. "Less cover for lookouts up there." As the men prepared to depart, a movement at the edge of town caught Ethan's attention. Eleanor Montgomery rode toward them on her bay mare, dressed not in the morning clothes one might expect, but in practical riding attire. Split skirt, sturdy boots, and a man's duster coat that had likely belonged to her brother. A rifle scabbard was attached to her saddle, and even from a distance, Ethan could see the determination set into every line of her body. "Damn it," he muttered, spurring his horse forward to intercept her before she reached the posse. The two met in the middle of the dusty street, Ethan positioning his mount to block her path. "What do you think you're doing, Eleanor?" His voice was low, meant for her ears alone, despite the curious glances from townspeople beginning their day. "I'm coming with you." Her chin lifted in the stubborn gesture he had once found endearing, but now filled him with dread. "Samuel was my brother. I have more right than anyone to see justice done." Ethan leaned closer, fighting to keep his frustration in check. "This isn't some church social I can escort you to. We're tracking dangerous men who've already shown they're willing to kill. Men who would think nothing of doing worse to a woman caught in their path." The words were harsh, deliberately so, but Eleanor didn't flinch. "I grew up on a farm in Pennsylvania during the war, Ethan. I've handled a rifle since I was 12. I buried a husband who was shot by road agents in Colorado, and I crossed half a continent alone to start a new life here." Her blue eyes flashed with conviction. "Don't confuse me with some delicate Eastern flower who needs protection." The standoff continued for several tense moments, neither willing to yield. Finally, Ethan tried a different approach. "Eleanor, I need to focus on tracking Carson. Every man in that posse needs to concentrate on the job at hand, not worry about protecting you, no matter how capable you are." He reached across the space between their horses to touch her arm. "Please, go back to town. Make arrangements for Samuel. Let me do what I swore an oath to do." Something shifted in Eleanor's expression, not softening exactly, but a calculation, a weighing of options. "Very well, Sheriff," she said finally. The formal address like a wall erected between them. "I'll trust you to bring Samuel's murderer to justice." The compliance came too easily, raising Ethan's suspicions, but he had a posse waiting and Carson's trail growing colder by the minute. As Eleanor turned her horse back toward town, Ethan called after her, "I'll send word as soon as we have Carson in custody." She looked back over her shoulder, her expression unreadable in the morning light. "See that you do." With those cryptic words, she rode away, leaving Ethan with a sense of unease that wouldn't dissipate. Deputy Wilson approached, his weathered face creased with concern. "Everything all right with the Mrs.-to-be?" Ethan watched Eleanor's retreating figure for a moment longer before turning his horse toward the waiting men. "No, but that will have to wait. We've got work to do." With a sharp whistle, he signaled the posse to move out, leading them north toward the mountains that had swallowed Jack Carson and his men. Behind them, Redemption Creek returned to its morning routines, unaware of the forces set in motion that would soon test the very foundations of law and personal vengeance in their frontier community. The journey to Blackwater Canyon took the better part of the day, with the posse following a trail that grew more distinct as they advanced. Carson had made little effort to conceal his party's passage, a confidence that concerned Ethan more than any attempted deception might have. Men who didn't bother hiding their tracks either believed they couldn't be caught or were setting a trap. By mid-afternoon, they reached the eastern approach to the canyon, dismounting to lead their horses along a narrow ridge that offered a vantage point over the main passage below. "There," Wilson murmured, pointing to a thin column of smoke rising from among the pines about a half-mile ahead. "Looks like they've made camp at the old mining shack." Ethan studied the location through his field glasses, noting the natural defensive position backed against a sheer rock face with clear lines of sight in most directions. "They'll have a lookout," he said, scanning the surrounding terrain. "Probably up on that northern outcrop." He handed the glasses to Wilson, who grunted in agreement after a brief survey. "5 horses in that corral they've rigged. Matches what the Wheeler boy reported." The men gathered in a tight circle as Ethan outlined his plan, keeping his voice low despite their distance from the outlaws' camp. "Wilson and I will circle around to approach from the west. Jameson and Parker, you two create a diversion to the south. Make enough noise to draw attention, but stay out of the line of fire. Miller and Thompson, you secure the horses to cut off their escape route." He fixed each man with a steady gaze. "Remember, we want Carson alive if possible. He needs to stand trial for what he's done, answer for his crimes before the law." As the men moved to their positions, Ethan found himself thinking of Eleanor, wondering what she was doing at that moment. The practical part of him hoped she was making arrangements for her brother's burial, finding solace in the rituals of mourning. But another part, the part that had come to know her determined spirit, feared she was planning something reckless. He pushed the thought aside as he and Wilson crept through the underbrush toward the western approach to the camp. They were about 50 yards out when the first gunshot shattered the afternoon quiet, followed immediately by a cry of pain that wasn't part of any planned diversion. "Ambush!" Wilson hissed, dragging Ethan down behind a fallen log as bullets splintered the wood around them. Chaos erupted as the posse returned fire, the narrow canyon amplifying the gunshots into a deafening roar. Through the haze of gunsmoke, Ethan caught glimpses of movement around the shack. At least 4 men taking cover behind rocks and trees. "They were waiting for us," Wilson growled, chambering another round in his Winchester. "Someone in town must have tipped them off." The implications of that betrayal would have to wait. For now, Ethan focused on the immediate threat, calculating angles and positions as bullets continued to fly around them. "Cover me," he ordered, waiting for Wilson's answering nod before sprinting to a boulder 20 feet closer to the camp. From his new position, he had a clearer view of their opponents, and confirmed what he'd suspected. Among the men defending the camp, there was no sign of Jack Carson's distinctive silver-plated revolver. The gunfight continued for nearly 20 minutes, a stalemate broken when Thompson managed to work his way behind the corral. With a well-placed shot, he scattered the horses, sending them stampeding through the camp and forcing the outlaws to break cover. In the confusion, Ethan and his men pressed their advantage, closing in until 3 of Carson's gang lay dead in the dirt, and a 4th, wounded in the leg, threw down his weapon in surrender. As the gunfire ceased, Ethan approached the captured outlaw, a young man barely out of his teens, with fear etched across his dirt-streaked face. "Where's Carson?" Ethan demanded, holstering his Colt as Wilson kept his rifle trained on the prisoner. The young man's eyes darted nervously between the lawmen. "Ain't here," he stammered. "Rode out last night. Said he had unfinished business back in Redemption Creek." The words hit Ethan like a physical blow, sending ice through his veins. "He set us up," Wilson realized aloud. "Sent these boys to keep us occupied while he doubled back to town." But Ethan was already running toward the remaining horses, his mind filled with images of Eleanor, not as he'd left her that morning, composed and determined, but vulnerable to Carson's vengeance. "Take care of things here," he shouted to Wilson as he swung into the saddle, "and follow as quick as you can." Without waiting for a response, he spurred his mount down the canyon trail, pushing the animal harder than was wise on the treacherous terrain. Each hoofbeat seemed to echo the same terrible refrain in his mind. Carson was headed for Redemption Creek, for Eleanor, and Ethan had left her unprotected, believing the danger rode north with him. The journey back to town was a punishing race against fading light and his own darkest fears. Ethan's horse was lathered with sweat, sides heaving as they finally crested the last ridge, overlooking Redemption Creek shortly after dusk. The sight that greeted him stopped his heart. Orange flames illuminated the night sky above the south end of town, sending columns of sparks into the darkness. Even from a distance, he could tell the fire centered around the doctor's residence, where he'd left Eleanor the previous night. Desperate urgency propelled him down the slope, taking risks that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. As he thundered into town, residents were already forming a bucket brigade to combat the blaze, which had spread to a neighboring building. Ethan dismounted before his horse had fully stopped, grabbing the nearest townsman by the shoulders. "Where is Miss Montgomery? Was she inside?" The man, Jenkins from the general store, shook his head, coughing from the smoke that filled the air. "She left Dr. Sullivan's this morning after you rode out, moved her things to the hotel." Relief flooded through Ethan, quickly followed by renewed concern. If Eleanor wasn't at the doctor's house, where was she? And was the fire Carson's work? He pushed through the crowd toward the Redemption Creek Hotel, a two-story building that stood at the heart of the town's main street. The lobby was deserted, the clerk having joined the firefighting efforts outside. Ethan took the stairs two at a time, calling Eleanor's name as he reached the upper hallway. No response came from any of the rooms, and a quick check revealed her assigned quarters to be empty, the bed undisturbed. A cold certainty settled over him as he descended back to the street level. Eleanor wasn't waiting helplessly for Carson to find her. She was hunting him, just as Ethan had feared she might. As he emerged from the hotel, a voice called to him from across the street. "Sheriff, over here." Ethan turned to find Abigail Turner, the seamstress whose shop stood adjacent to the smoldering remains of Dr. Sullivan's house. The middle-aged woman beckoned urgently, drawing him into the relative quiet of her store. "Miss Montgomery was here earlier today," she said without preamble, her normally cheerful face grave with concern. "Asked to borrow men's clothing. Said hers had been destroyed in the ranch fire." Ethan's jaw tightened as Abigail continued. "I gave her some things that had belonged to my late husband. She changed right here in the shop, stuffed her hair up under a hat. If I hadn't known it was her..." The seamstress wrung her hands. "Sheriff, she had a gun belt with her. Not just any gun, one with silver plating and what looked like mother-of-pearl grips." The implication was unmistakable. Somehow, Eleanor had acquired Jack Carson's distinctive weapon, or one remarkably similar. "Did she say where she was going?" Ethan asked, struggling to maintain his professional demeanor when everything within him wanted to rush out and search every corner of town. Abigail shook her head. "Not directly, but she asked if I'd heard about any strangers in town. I mentioned that Walter at the livery stable said a man had paid extra to keep a fresh horse ready at all times. Said the fellow was staying at Dawson's boarding house on the edge of town." The seamstress lowered her voice. "That was about 4 hours ago, Sheriff. Just before sunset, I saw a fellow matching Carson's description ride hard out of town, heading east toward the old Spencer mine. Not 10 minutes later, I spotted someone following on a sorrel mare. From the way they sat the saddle, I'd have sworn it was a man. But now I'm certain it was her." Ethan's mind raced through the implications. The Spencer mine had been abandoned years ago, after a cave-in killed 3 workers. Its remote location had made it a favorite hiding place for outlaws passing through the territory. If Carson had indeed headed there, and Eleanor was in pursuit, then fierce came a scent. He thanked Abigail and strode quickly to the livery stable, where he requisitioned a fresh horse over the protests of Walter, who insisted his animals had done enough work for one day. "This can't wait till morning," Ethan said grimly, transferring his saddle to a sturdy bay gelding. "Send word to Deputy Wilson when he returns with the posse. Tell him I've gone to the Spencer mine and to follow with reinforcements." The urgency in the sheriff's voice must have convinced the stableman, who nodded reluctantly as he helped prepare the horse. Night had fully descended by the time Ethan set out on the eastern trail. Guided by the light of a three-quarter moon that cast silvery illumination over the landscape, the Spencer mine lay about 5 miles from town, nestled in a series of low hills that had once promised mineral wealth, but had ultimately yielded more disappointment than silver. As he rode, Ethan tried to make sense of Eleanor's actions. If she had indeed followed Carson alone, armed with what might be the outlaw's own weapon, what was her plan? Did she intend to confront him, to exact the personal vengeance she'd spoken of? The thought of her facing such a dangerous man alone filled him with cold dread. Carson was a killer many times over, a man who had nothing left to lose after the destruction of his gang. If he discovered Eleanor's pursuit, he wouldn't hesitate to add her to his list of victims. The dilapidated structures of the Spencer mining operation came into view as Ethan crested a small rise. Moonlight gleamed off the weathered tin roof of the main building, while the dark mouth of the mine shaft yawned like an ominous void in the hillside. 2 horses were tethered near a collapsed lean-to. One he recognized as the sorrel mare Abigail had described, the other a dun gelding that likely belonged to Carson. Ethan dismounted some distance away, securing his horse where it wouldn't be easily spotted before approaching on foot, his Colt drawn and ready. No light showed from the buildings, but as he drew closer, he detected movement inside the main structure, shadows shifting against shadows. Then came the sound that confirmed his worst fears. Eleanor's voice, steady but taut with emotion, carried clearly through the night air. "Did you think no one would come for you, Jack Carson? Did you think you could murder an innocent man and ride away free?" Moving with the silent precision born of years, tracking outlaws, Ethan positioned himself near a broken window, peering into the gloom of the building's interior. The scene inside froze his blood. Eleanor stood in the center of what had once been the mine office, her borrowed men's clothing giving her a strange, androgynous appearance in the faint moonlight that filtered through gaps in the roof. She held a revolver in a 2-handed grip, the silver plating catching what little light reached it. Across from her, partially obscured by shadow, stood Jack Carson, tall and lean, with the cold eyes of a man who killed without remorse. His hands were raised slightly, but his posture suggested calculation rather than surrender. "Well now, ain't you full of surprises?" Carson drawled, his voice carrying the lazy menace that had terrorized the territory for years. "The schoolmarm's got teeth after all." "I have more than teeth," Eleanor replied, and Ethan could hear the barely controlled fury beneath her calm exterior. "I have your gun. Took it off one of your men when they attacked my ranch. The man who was holding it didn't need it anymore after I put a rifle bullet through his chest." This revelation stunned Ethan almost as much as Carson, whose momentary confusion confirmed the truth of her claim. Eleanor Montgomery, the refined school teacher from Boston, had killed during the raid on her ranch, a fact she hadn't shared with anyone, not even Ethan. "You've been planning this since yesterday," he realized, speaking the words aloud without intending to. Both occupants of the room turned at the sound of his voice, Carson's hand dropping instinctively toward his hip where his signature weapon would normally rest. Ethan. Eleanor's voice held a complex mixture of emotions. Surprise, frustration, perhaps even relief, though she didn't lower the revolver still aimed at Carson's chest. "You're supposed to be in Blackwater Canyon with the posse." The sheriff stepped through the doorway, his own weapon trained on Carson as he moved to position himself between Eleanor and the outlaw. Carson wasn't there. He sent his men to distract us while he doubled back to town. His eyes never left the outlaw as he addressed Eleanor. "Give me the gun, Eleanor. This isn't the way." A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "The way? What way would that be, Sheriff? The way of the law that lets men like him escape justice more often than not? The way that would see my brother's murder avenged by a hanging months from now, if we're lucky enough to get a conviction?" Carson watched the exchange with calculating eyes, clearly assessing his options as the two focused on each other. "Seems like you've got yourself a problem here, Sheriff," he observed with a smirk that didn't reach his cold gaze. "Lady wants blood, and you're standing in her way. Question is, whose side are you really on?" Ethan didn't rise to the bait, keeping his attention divided between Carson and Eleanor, who still hadn't lowered the silver-plated revolver. "This isn't about sides," he said firmly. "This is about who we become when we choose revenge over justice. Eleanor, you're not a killer." The words hung in the air between them, challenged by the revelation of what had happened during the ranch raid. "I already am," she said quietly. "When they killed Samuel, when I saw what they'd done to him, something changed in me, Ethan. Something I can't take back." The moment stretched, taut with possibility, as Ethan tried to reach the woman he loved through the veneer of cold determination she'd wrapped around herself. "One act in defense of your home doesn't define you," he insisted. "But this, hunting a man down in cold blood, this would change everything. Not just for you, but for us." Eleanor's eyes flickered, the first sign that his words might be penetrating the armor of her grief and rage. Carson, sensing the shift, made his move with the lightning speed that had kept him alive through countless confrontations. His hand dropped to his boot, emerging with a small derringer that had escaped detection. Before he could aim, Ethan fired, the report of his Colt deafening in the confined space. Carson staggered backward, clutching his shoulder as the hidden gun clattered to the floor. "You had your chance at a clean death, Carson," Ethan said, advancing on the wounded outlaw with his revolver still raised. "Now you'll stand trial for Samuel Montgomery's murder, for the raid on the ranch, and for every other crime you've committed in this territory." He reached for the handcuffs on his belt, intending to secure Carson before the man could attempt any further resistance. Behind him, the soft click of a hammer being cocked froze him mid-motion. "Step aside, Ethan." Eleanor's voice had changed, a resolve in it that brooked no argument. "He doesn't deserve a trial. He deserves what he gave Samuel, a bullet with no warning, no chance to defend himself." Ethan turned slowly to face her, positioning himself squarely between her and Carson. The silver revolver was aimed at his chest now, though her hands trembled slightly for the first time since he'd entered the building. "If you want him, you'll have to go through me," Ethan said quietly. "And I don't believe you can do that, no matter how much you think you've changed." Their eyes locked in a silent battle of wills, the moment suspended in the dusty air of the abandoned mine office. "He murdered my brother," Eleanor whispered, anguish finally breaking through her composed exterior. "I held Samuel as he died. Do you know what his last words were? He apologized to me, apologized for leaving me alone again." Tears streaked the dust on her face, glittering in the dim light. "I'm not just doing this for Samuel. I'm doing it for me. For the life Carson stole from us, Ethan took a cautious step toward her, then another, until the barrel of the revolver pressed against his chest, directly over his heart. "You're not alone, Eleanor," he said softly. "You have me. You have a future in Redemption Creek. Don't throw that away for a moment of vengeance that won't bring Samuel back and won't give you the peace you're looking for." His hand slowly rose to cover hers where it gripped the revolver, feeling the tremors that ran through her. "I've seen what killing does to a person's soul, even when it's justified. It takes something from you that you can never get back. I don't want that for you." Behind him, Carson shifted position, likely trying to reach for the fallen Derringer. Without taking his eyes from Eleanor's face, Ethan spoke over his shoulder. "Move again, Carson, and I'll let her shoot you after all." The outlaw subsided with a muttered curse, clearly recognizing the genuine threat in the sheriff's voice. The standoff continued for what seemed an eternity. The only sounds their breathing and the distant call of a night bird outside. Finally, something in Eleanor's expression changed, a softening around her eyes that suggested the internal battle was reaching its conclusion. "If I give you this gun," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "you promise me he'll face justice? Real justice, not some territorial judge who can be bribed or threatened?" Ethan nodded solemnly. "I'll personally escort him to Fort Smith for trial before Judge Parker himself. The hanging judge doesn't bend for any man, and he's been wanting Carson in his courtroom for years." He maintained steady pressure on her hand, gradually directing the weapon's aim away from his chest. "Carson will pay for what he's done, to Samuel, to you, to everyone who suffered because of him. I swear it on my badge and on my love for you." The words penetrated the last of Eleanor's resolve. With a shuddering breath that might have been a sob, she released her grip on the revolver, allowing Ethan to take it from her unresisting fingers. The silver-plated weapon felt strangely heavy in his hand as he tucked it into his belt, drawing Eleanor into a protective embrace with his free arm while keeping his Colt trained on Carson. "It's over," he murmured into her hair as she buried her face against his shoulder. "It's over now." Carson watched them with undisguised contempt, blood seeping through the fingers pressed to his wounded shoulder. "Touching scene, Sheriff," he sneered, "but we both know how this really ends. You won't get me to Fort Smith alive. My boys will be coming for me long before then." Ethan's response was interrupted by the sound of approaching riders, the posse returning from Blackwater Canyon, led by Deputy Wilson, who must have pushed hard to reach the mine so quickly. As hoofbeats and voices filled the night outside, Ethan felt Eleanor straighten in his arms, drawing strength from his presence and from the knowledge that Carson would indeed face the justice system, however imperfect it might be. "Your boys are either dead or in custody," Ethan informed Carson as Wilson and two other men entered, rifles at the ready. "The Carson gang is finished for good this time." He turned to his deputy, keeping one arm around Eleanor's shoulders. "Get him patched up enough to travel and put him in irons. We ride for Fort Smith at first light." Wilson nodded, his weathered face showing satisfaction as he recognized the notorious outlaw, now surrounded by armed lawmen. As Carson was led outside, cursing and threatening with diminishing conviction, Ethan turned his full attention to Eleanor. In the silver moonlight, filtering through the damaged roof, her face showed the exhaustion and emotional strain of the past 36 hours. "You followed me," she said, a question in her tone despite the obvious fact. Ethan nodded, reaching up to brush a strand of hair from her face. "Always," he replied simply, "just as you followed Carson. The difference is, I came to save you, not to seek revenge." A ghost of a smile touched her lips for the first time since Samuel's death. "And did you? Save me, I mean?" The question held layers of meaning that weren't lost on either of them. Ethan considered his answer carefully, aware of the journey she had undertaken from grief to vengeance and finally to acceptance. "I think we saved each other," he said finally. "You from crossing a line you couldn't come back from, and me from failing the woman I love when she needed me most." He glanced down at the silver-plated revolver tucked into his belt, the weapon that had symbolized Carson's reign of terror and nearly become the instrument of Eleanor's transformation into something she was never meant to be. "What happens now?" Eleanor asked, her voice steadier as the immediate crisis receded. "After Carson stands trial, after all this is behind us?" Ethan took her hand, leading her toward the doorway where the night air promised a cleansing breath after the dust and tension of the abandoned mine. "That's up to you," he said. "The wedding can wait until you've had time to mourn Samuel properly. We have time now." They emerged into the moonlit night where the posse had secured Carson and was preparing for the journey back to Redemption Creek. Eleanor paused, looking up at the star-filled sky above the harsh landscape that had claimed so much from her, yet somehow offered the possibility of a new beginning. "I don't want to wait," she said, turning to face Ethan with newfound clarity in her eyes. "Samuel wouldn't want me to put my life on hold because of his death. He came west so I could build a future with you, and that's what I intend to do." Ethan studied her face, searching for any sign that she was making this decision from a place of shock or unresolved grief. What he found instead was the quiet strength and determination that had first drawn him to her, tempered now by an understanding of how fragile and precious life could be. "When I return from Fort Smith, then," he agreed, his heart lightening despite the somber circumstances, "we'll honor Samuel's memory by living the life he wanted for you." Eleanor nodded, her gaze moving to Carson, who sat slumped on his horse under the watchful eyes of Deputy Wilson. "Justice, not revenge," she murmured, as if testing the concept. "It's a harder path, isn't it?" Ethan followed her line of sight to the captured outlaw who had caused so much pain, yet would now face judgment through the system Ethan had sworn to uphold. "Harder, yes," he acknowledged, "but it's the only path that doesn't destroy the one walking it." As they mounted their horses to join the procession back to town, the eastern sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, a fitting symbol for the new day that awaited them beyond the long shadow of vengeance. 1 month later, Sheriff Ethan Blackwood stood on the porch of a new house on the outskirts of Redemption Creek, watching as the evening sun painted the distant mountains with hues of gold and purple. The home had been a wedding gift from the townspeople, built on a plot of land near where Eleanor's ranch had once stood. Though smaller than the original structure, it represented something more important than mere shelter. It symbolized the community's recognition of what both he and Eleanor had sacrificed to maintain justice in a land where personal vengeance often prevailed. The sound of footsteps behind him announced his wife's presence before her arms slipped around his waist. "Telegram came while you were checking the property line," Eleanor said, resting her head against his shoulder. "Judge Parker's verdict was delivered yesterday. Carson will hang next week." Ethan nodded, having expected nothing less from the infamous hanging judge, whose courtroom in Fort Smith had seen the end of many an outlaw's career. "Will that bring you peace?" he asked, covering her hands with his own. Eleanor was silent for a moment, considering the question with the thoughtfulness that characterized her approach to life's more difficult matters. "Not peace, exactly," she finally replied. "Samuel is still gone. Nothing can change that." or make it right. She moved to stand beside him at the railing, looking out over the land that had tested them both so severely, yet had ultimately brought them together. But there's a rightness to it, a sense that the world still has order. He turned to face her, studying the face that had become even dearer to him through their shared trials. The grief for her brother remained, visible in quiet moments when memory would overtake her. But it no longer consumed her as it had in those dark days after Samuel's murder. "Do you ever regret not pulling that trigger?" The question was one he'd never asked, uncertain if he wanted to hear the answer. Eleanor met his gaze steadily, her blue eyes clear in the fading light. "Sometimes," she admitted, "in my darkest moments, when I wake from nightmares of Samuel's death. But then I remember what you said in that abandoned mine, about what killing does to a person's soul." She reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the lines etched by years of making difficult choices in the name of law and order. "You saved me from becoming someone I wouldn't recognize, someone Samuel wouldn't recognize." The admission hung between them, honest and unvarnished. "Besides," she added, with a hint of a smile that was becoming more frequent as healing progressed, "as satisfying as it might have been in that moment to end Carson's life myself, I much prefer the life we're building now." Ethan drew her into his embrace as the first stars appeared in the deepening blue of the evening sky. Beyond their property, Redemption Creek settled into its nighttime routines, secure in the knowledge that justice had prevailed, not through the barrel of a gun, but through the steadfast commitment of a sheriff who believed in the law, and a woman who had ultimately chosen love over vengeance. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.